It all began with the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the stillness of a quiet night. The sound of the cruiser's siren was shrill, slicing through the air, commanding everything and everyone to stop. A woman sat behind the wheel of her car, the soft glow of her dashboard the only light in her face. Her name, Judge Camille Devine. But tonight, on this roadside stretch, she wasn't wearing her black robe of justice. She was just another black woman alone on a dimly lit street. The city hummed in the background, alive with its usual nighttime rhythm. Camille had spent the evening at dinner with friends, the kind of dinner that reminded her of the simplicity of laughter and warmth. She had felt light as she drove home, her mind wandering to the pressing court case scheduled for the next day. A case that carried weight, like so many did, with lives hanging in the balance of her judgment. Camille had always prided herself on her razor sharp intellect and unwavering fairness, attributes that had earned her respect in the courtroom. But outside the courthouse, she wasn't immune to the harsh reality of being a black woman in a world that often saw her differently than she saw herself. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror jolted her out of her thoughts. A spike of confusion rippled through her as she pulled over to the side of the road. Her mind immediately began to assess the situation. Had she unknowingly run a light? Was there something wrong with her car? She rolled down her window as the two officers approached, their faces masked by the blinding glare of their flashlights. Mom, license, and registration. One officer barked, his tone sharp and clipped. It wasn't a question, it was a command. Certainly, officer, Camille replied, keeping her voice steady, polite, even as her nerves began to tighten. She handed over her documents, her fingers brushing against the edges of her leather license holder. Her heartbeat quickened as she watched them glance at her papers, exchanging a glance that made her stomach drop. Do you know why we stopped you? The second officer asked, his voice loaded with an unspoken suspicion. No, sir, Camille replied. I'm not sure. Is something wrong? The answer came in a tone that made her skin prickle. They accused her of fitting the description of someone involved in a robbery nearby. Her confusion quickly morphed into shock. She tried to remain calm, to explain that there must be some mistake. But the officers weren't interested in listening. Their questions became sharper, their assumptions louder than the words they spoke. Camille felt the balance of power shift dangerously, the weight of their stares heavy on her. I think you've made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking slightly under the strain of holding her composure. I'm Judge Camille Devine. I work. One of the officers cut her off with a sharp laugh. Sure you are, he said, his voice dripping with disbelief. Step out of the vehicle. Her protests were swallowed by the night as she was ordered out of her car. Within moments, her hands were yanked behind her back, cold steel biting into her wrists. Camille's cheeks burned with humiliation as onlookers began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. The murmurs of the small crowd felt like waves crashing against her, and her pulse roared in her ears. How could this be happening? She thought. She was a judge, a pillar of the justice system. Yet here she was, reduced to just another black woman being treated as less than. The holding cell was a frigid, metallic space that seemed to mock her. Camille sat on the cold bench, the weight of the night pressing down on her. She thought of her parents, of the lessons they had instilled in her. Her mother, a proud marcher in the civil rights movement, had always told her that progress required perseverance. Her father had believed that education was the most powerful weapon against ignorance. But as Camille sat there, stripped of dignity, she wondered if any of it had been enough. Her protest that she was a judge fell on deaf ears. The officers laughed, their disbelief evident. To them, she wasn't a respected figure in the legal system. She was a black woman, easy to stereotype, easy to dismiss. Hours passed before a call was made to confirm her identity. When the truth finally surfaced, the officer's smug demeanor faltered. They released her with a few muttered apologies, but the damage was already done. The story exploded the next day. News outlets plastered her face across screens and papers, the headlines screaming about the injustice she had endured. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Activists and community leaders rallied around her, demanding accountability. Camille, however, stayed silent. She knew her moment to speak would come, but when it did, she wanted her words to resonate beyond her personal experience. Days later, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The same officers who had arrested her now stood before her bench, charged with misconduct. As they entered, dressed in their uniforms, they froze. Recognition rippled across their faces as they realized who was seated at the bench. It was her, the woman they had humiliated, the woman whose dignity they had stripped away. Camille's gaze was steady, her black robe a powerful symbol of the authority she wielded. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it crack her composure. Leaning forward slightly, she spoke, her voice calm but unyielding. "Gentlemen," she said, her words slicing through the heavy silence. "Do you recognize me?" One officer stammered, "Why, yes, Your Honor." Camille's expression remained steady, but there was a fire in her eyes. "The Constitution guarantees every citizen the right to equal protection under the law," she continued. "That means people like me, people like you. And yet, you chose to act out of prejudice rather than principle." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. The room was silent, save for the scratching of pens as reporters captured every syllable. This moment wasn't just about her arrest. It was about every person who had ever been marginalized, dehumanized, or silenced. The officers were found guilty of misconduct, their actions condemned by both the court and the public. But Camille's journey didn't end there. The incident became a turning point in her life, propelling her into the spotlight as an advocate for systemic change. She wrote op-eds, spoke at rallies, and partnered with grassroots organizations to push for police reform. Her pain became her fuel, her platform a beacon of hope for others. Years later, Camille stood on a stage, addressing a crowd of young law students. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding. "You'll face moments in life that test your resolve," she said. "Moments that make you question everything you believe in. But those moments, they're not the end of your story. They're just the beginning." As the crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous, Camille smiled. She thought of that night, the flashing lights, the cold handcuffs, the humiliation, and how it had all transformed her. Her story was proof that justice, though delayed, was never out of reach. She had turned her pain into power, her power into purpose. And she knew, standing there on that stage, that her journey was far from over. 40.